A man swallows a cyanide capsule and pulls a trigger in the same second, in a concrete bunker 50 feet under a burning city. 2 days later, his ally is shot dead by his own neighbors and left hanging upside down from a gas station roof for the crowd to spit on. Absolute power built these men palaces, armies, statues of themselves in every town square. It could not build them a peaceful death. Every single one of them, sooner or later, paid for it. And how they paid is stranger, uglier, and more revealing than anything they ever did in power. For 100 years, dictators have followed the same script. Seize the state, crush the opposition, build a cult of personality, promise it will last forever. It never does. What's fascinating isn't that they fall. It's how differently they fall. Some die in fire. Some die in a courtroom built overnight just to convict them. Some die old, rich, and free, having gotten away with everything. This video walks through the deaths of history's most infamous dictators, in escalating order of chaos, so you can see exactly how the story ends for the men who thought they were untouchable. Let's start with the exception that proves the rule, because it's the most infuriating case on this list. Francisco Franco ruled Spain for 36 years after winning a brutal civil war in 1939, a war that killed an estimated 500,000 people. He spent decades running secret prisons, ordering executions of political opponents, and suppressing entire regions of his own country by force. And then, in 1975, at the age of 82, he died in a hospital bed in Madrid, of Parkinson's disease, heart failure, and complications from multiple surgeries, surrounded by doctors, in the country he'd ruled with an iron fist since before most of the population was born. His final weeks were a medical horror show that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the era's medicine. Doctors kept him artificially alive for over a month through more than 20 surgical interventions, hooked to machines, his organs failing one by one, while state media told the Spanish public he was recovering. He was formally declared dead on November 20, 1975, a date Franco loyalists still mark every year, because it happens to be the same date, decades earlier, that a founder of Spain's fascist movement was executed. He was buried in a monumental tomb he'd built for himself, inside a mountain, with a cross taller than the Statue of Liberty rising above it. That tomb stayed a pilgrimage site for the far right for 44 years. Spain didn't exhume his remains and move them to a regular cemetery until 2019. No trial. No prison cell. No firing squad. Franco is the baseline every other name on this list gets measured against. Because he's the one who proved a dictator absolutely can die peacefully in bed, if the political winds line up right. Keep that in mind, because almost nobody else on this list got that lucky. But for every dictator who slipped away quietly, there's another who didn't get a single second of warning. North Korea's Kim Il-sung is the second name on our died peacefully list, and his death is stranger than Franco's, because of what happened to his body afterward. On July 8, 1994, at age 82, Kim Il-sung reportedly collapsed from a sudden heart attack while in a meeting about a hydroelectric dam project, at his residence outside Pyongyang. State doctors said his heart simply gave out. Some outside reports claimed a resuscitation team wasn't reached in time because of the country's mountainous terrain and outdated phone lines. Whatever the exact final hour looked like, the result was the same: North Korea's eternal president, the man who had ruled since 1948 and built a personality cult unlike anything else on Earth, was gone in minutes. What happened next is the real story. His body was embalmed using techniques reportedly borrowed from the same process used on Lenin and Mao, and placed on permanent public display in a massive mausoleum called Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, his actual former residence, converted into a shrine. Millions of North Koreans have since been required to file past his glass casket in scheduled visits, bowing 3 times, as part of state-mandated mourning rituals that continue to this day, 3 decades later. His son, Kim Jong-il, inherited total control within days, cementing the only hereditary communist dynasty in modern history. A dynasty now on its 3rd generation with Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung's death didn't end anything. It was simply the transfer point in a family business of absolute power that's still running today. Not every dictator's family got to keep the throne this cleanly. Some fell apart within days of the body going cold. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, for 32 years, looting an estimated $4 to $5 billion from a nation that remained one of the poorest on Earth the entire time he did it. He built a personal palace with its own airport runway long enough to land a Concorde jet, just so he could fly in French champagne and fresh food from Europe. By 1997, rebel forces under Laurent Desire Kabila were closing in on the capital, Kinshasa. Mobutu was already dying of prostate cancer, undergoing treatment in Europe between fleeing battles. He left the country for the final time in May 1997, just days before rebels took the capital, and never set foot in it again. He died 4 months later, in September 1997, in a villa in Rabat, Morocco, at 66 years old, not from a bullet, not from a courtroom, but from cancer that had already spread through his body while he was still trying to run a war from a hospital bed abroad. No funeral of state. No return home. He was buried in a Christian cemetery in Rabat, a country that wasn't his, in a grave that Congo's government refused for years to even discuss repatriating. The man who once controlled a nation 2/3 the size of Western Europe died essentially stateless, his fortune scattered across Swiss banks that slowly unfroze and redirected the money over the following decades. Dying broke and forgotten is one kind of ending. Dying at the hands of the very people you used to command is a completely different kind of ending, and that's where this list turns dark fast. Rafael Trujillo ruled the Dominican Republic for 31 years with a level of paranoid brutality that historians still use as a case study. His secret police, the SIM, assassinated critics abroad, and in 1937 he ordered the Parsley Massacre, in which somewhere between 9,000 and 20,000 Haitian civilians were killed over the course of about a week. Soldiers reportedly used pronunciation of the word perejil, parsley, to identify Haitian Creole speakers before executing them. His downfall came from inside his own circle. On the night of May 30, 1961, a group of conspirators, several of them former loyalists, one of whom had lost family members to Trujillo's regime, ambushed his car on a highway outside the capital, Santo Domingo. Trujillo was riding, as he often did, without heavy escort, confident in his own invincibility after 3 decades in power. The conspirators opened fire with rifles and pistols. Trujillo was hit multiple times and died at the scene, still inside the vehicle. The aftermath was almost as brutal as the assassination itself. Trujillo's son, Ramfis, returned from Paris and launched a revenge campaign, hunting down and torturing the conspirators one by one over the following months. Several were captured and executed without trial. Some were reportedly fed to sharks off the coast. The dictator was gone, but the machine of fear he'd built took months to fully collapse behind him. An ambush on a highway is bad. Being turned over to your own people for a public execution is worse. And that's exactly what happened to the next name on this list. Anastasio Somoza Debayle was the last of a 3-generation family dictatorship that ruled Nicaragua for over 40 years combined. After the Sandinista revolution finally forced him out in 1979, he fled, first to the United States, then, after being denied permanent refuge, to Paraguay, under the protection of that country's own dictator, Alfredo Stroessner. He thought Paraguay was safe. He was wrong. On September 17, 1980, in the capital city of Asunción, a team connected to Argentine and Sandinista operatives ambushed his car with a bazooka and automatic weapons fire as he was being driven to a residence. The rocket tore through the vehicle. Somoza and his driver and financial advisor were killed almost instantly. Photos from the immediate aftermath show a car reduced to twisted metal, one of the most violent assassinations of any deposed dictator in modern Latin American history. He had escaped his own country's revolution only to be hunted down and killed in someone else's. Proof that for men like this, distance is never really safety. So far, we've gone from Franco dying peacefully in bed, to Kim Il-sung collapsing mid-meeting, to Mobutu wasting away from cancer in exile, to Trujillo ambushed on his own highway, to Somoza blown up by a bazooka in a country that wasn't even his. Every step on this list, the deaths get more violent and more public. And we're only just getting started, because the next few dictators didn't just get killed. They got caught, tried, and executed in front of the entire world. Idi Amin ruled Uganda for 8 years, from 1971 to 1979, and in that time is estimated to have overseen the deaths of anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 Ugandans. The range is that wide because record-keeping under his regime was virtually non-existent, and mass graves are still being found decades later. He expelled Uganda's entire Asian minority population, roughly 80,000 people, giving them 90 days to leave the country with almost nothing. When Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles finally toppled him in 1979, Amin didn't face a tribunal. He fled first to Libya, then settled permanently in Saudi Arabia, which granted him asylum on the condition, reportedly, that he stay out of politics entirely. He spent the next 24 years living in a comfortable villa in Jeddah, funded by a Saudi royal stipend, reportedly enjoying fishing trips and a quiet family life, never extradited, never charged, never facing a single one of his victims in a courtroom. He died on August 16, 2003, at around 78 years old, of multiple organ failure caused by high blood pressure, after weeks in a Jeddah hospital. Uganda's government at the time said it would only allow his body back for burial if he faced justice for his crimes. Since he was already dead, that offer went nowhere. He was buried in Saudi Arabia, in a simple grave, having outlived thousands of his victims by decades and never once been held legally accountable. Amin died comfortable and free. The next dictator wasn't so lucky, because his own country built an entire trial around making sure the whole world watched him pay. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq for 24 years, through the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, and a domestic reign of terror that included the 1988 Halabja chemical attack, which killed an estimated 3,200 to 5,000 Kurdish civilians in a single day using mustard gas and nerve agents. After the 2003 US-led invasion toppled his government, Saddam went into hiding. He was found on December 13, 2003, by American forces, hiding in a 9-foot-deep dirt hole near a farmhouse in Ad-Dor, near his hometown of Tikrit, a hiding spot soldiers nicknamed the Spider Hole. Photos of him afterward show a man unrecognizable from his own propaganda. Matted beard, disheveled, blinking under a flashlight, a world away from the tailored military uniforms and mustache of his official portraits. He was tried by the Iraqi Special Tribunal, a court set up specifically for his case, and convicted in November 2006 for the killing of 148 Shia men and boys in the town of Dujail in 1982, in retaliation for an assassination attempt against him. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place on December 30, 2006, at Camp Justice, a former military intelligence facility in Baghdad, on the first day of Eid al-Adha, an Islamic holiday, which added enormous controversy given the timing. An unauthorized cell phone video, shot by one of the guards, leaked within hours and spread globally. It shows guards taunting him on the gallows, chanting the name of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, and Saddam responding with defiance before the trapdoor opened. The leaked footage turned what was meant to be a controlled, dignified state execution into a chaotic viral video watched by hundreds of millions of people, and it remains one of the only times in modern history a head of state's execution has been captured on unauthorized video and distributed globally within hours. Saddam's death was chaotic, but it still happened inside an official government process, with a judge, a verdict, and a scheduled date. The next one on this list didn't even get that. He was executed on Christmas Day, by a firing squad, after a trial that lasted less than 2 hours. Nicolae Ceaușescu ruled Romania for 24 years as one of the most repressive communist leaders in the Eastern Bloc, building a secret police force, the Securitate, so pervasive that Romanians reportedly avoided speaking freely even inside their own homes. While ordinary Romanians endured food rationing and freezing winters with government-mandated power cuts, Ceaușescu was building himself the Palace of the Parliament, the second largest administrative building on Earth after the Pentagon. In December 1989, as revolutions swept across Eastern Europe, protests broke out in the city of Timisoara and spread nationwide within days. On December 21, Ceaușescu gave a public speech from a balcony in Bucharest meant to rally support, and for the first time in his life, the crowd turned on him live, booing and jeering, visibly rattled on camera in a moment broadcast on state television. He and his wife Elena fled the capital by helicopter the next day but were captured by the army shortly after landing. What happened next moved faster than almost any dictator's downfall in modern history. On December 25, 1989, Christmas Day, the couple was given a 2-hour military trial inside an army barracks in Targovist, on charges including genocide and undermining the national economy. There was no real defense. The verdict was effectively predetermined. Immediately after sentencing, the couple was taken outside, tied at the wrists, and executed by firing squad against a wall. Footage of the aftermath, including their bodies, was broadcast on Romanian television within hours, making it one of the fastest, most public falls of any head of state in the 20th century. From applauded dictator, to booed at a rally, to executed corpse on national TV, in under 4 days. We've now gone from quiet natural deaths, to ambushes and assassinations, to full public trials ending in hanging and firing squads. But everything up to this point still had some form of process. A courtroom, a verdict, a scheduled execution. What comes next has none of that. What comes next is when the process disappears completely, and the crowd becomes the executioner. Pol Pot led the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979, a period during which an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population, died from execution, starvation, forced labor, and disease, in an attempt to engineer a radical agrarian utopia from scratch. Entire cities were emptied by force within days of the regime taking power. After being toppled by a Vietnamese invasion in 1979, Pol Pot spent nearly 2 decades hiding in remote jungle strongholds along the Thai-Cambodian border, still nominally leading remnants of the Khmer Rouge even as the movement fractured. In 1997, his own former allies turned on him, staging a show trial within the movement itself and sentencing him to life under house arrest in the jungle. A strange, smaller-scale echo of the very tactics his own regime had used on others. He died on April 15, 1998, at approximately age 72, in a jungle hut near the Thai border, reportedly of heart failure, just as international pressure was mounting for Cambodia to finally hand him over for a war crimes tribunal. His body was cremated on a pile of old tires and garbage within days, on the orders of his former comrades, in what many historians see as a deliberate move to erase evidence before outside investigators could examine his remains. To this day, some historians and former associates have raised the possibility that he was poisoned or given a fatal dose of medication to prevent him from testifying and implicating others. But no full independent investigation was ever conducted, and the truth may never be confirmed. He remains the only man on this list responsible for one of history's largest death tolls per capita, and the only one who was never formally tried for it by anyone. Pol Pot escaped justice through a quiet death and a hasty cremation. The next name on this list didn't get anything quiet. His death is the single most chaotic, most public, most filmed execution on this entire list. Benito Mussolini ruled Italy for 21 years and effectively invented the modern template for fascism that other regimes on this list would later copy. By April 1945, with Allied forces closing in and his alliance with Hitler collapsing along with the war itself, Mussolini attempted to flee north toward Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Petaxi, disguised in a German army coat and helmet, riding in a convoy of retreating German trucks. Italian partisans stopped the convoy near Lake Como on April 27, 1945, and recognized him despite the disguise. He and Petaxi were captured and held overnight. The next day, April 28, both were shot by partisan forces in the small village of Giulino di Mezzegra. Accounts of the exact circumstances vary, but the outcome was the same. No trial, no formal process, executed within about 24 hours of capture. Their bodies, along with several other executed fascist officials, were then transported to Milan and dumped in the Piazza Loreto, deliberately chosen, because it was the same square where partisans had recently been publicly executed by Mussolini's own regime. A furious crowd gathered, beat and spat on the corpses, and the bodies were eventually strung up by their feet from the girders of a gas station roof, hanging upside down in front of thousands of onlookers, in photographs that remain some of the most infamous images to come out of the collapse of European fascism. Mussolini's death was chaotic and public, but even that took place a full day after his capture. The next dictator on this list didn't even survive that long once his own capital fell around him. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler was living underground, in the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, as Soviet artillery shells landed within blocks of the entrance and the city collapsed floor by floor above him. 12 years of the regime he'd built, and the war he'd started, had led to the deaths of an estimated 70 to 85 million people worldwide when combined with all theaters of World War II, including the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust he had personally ordered. On April 29, 1945, In a small underground ceremony inside the bunker, Hitler married his longtime partner Eva Braun. Less than 40 hours later, on the afternoon of April 30th, with Soviet troops reportedly less than 500 meters from the bunker entrance, the couple retreated into a private study. Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule and, in the same instant, shot himself with a pistol, a double-method suicide apparently intended to guarantee death even if one method failed. Eva Braun died from the cyanide capsule alone. Per Hitler's own explicit instructions, aides carried both bodies up into the Chancellery garden, doused them in gasoline, and set them on fire in a shallow crater, as Soviet shells continued falling nearby, a hasty, undignified cremation carried out by subordinates trying not to get killed themselves in the process. Soviet forces recovered charred remains days later. Fragments were eventually confirmed via dental records decades afterward, since the Soviets kept the exact fate of the remains classified for years, fueling decades of conspiracy theories that he had somehow escaped. The man who had built an empire on the promise it would last 1,000 years was dead within 2 years of that promise, burned in a hole in his own garden, by his own hand, 12 days before Germany formally surrendered. Hitler's death took less than a minute once he decided to go through with it. The next name on this list didn't get a bunker, a capsule, or even a bullet delivered quickly. His death stretched out over hours, in the street, in front of a phone camera held by the very people he used to rule. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades and is directly responsible for the deaths of an estimated 20 million people or more through purges, forced collectivization, engineered famines like the Holodomor in Ukraine, and the Gulag prison camp system. On the night of March 1, 1953, Stalin suffered what was almost certainly a massive stroke at his dacha outside Moscow, collapsing alone in a room after his guards had already gone to bed. Here's the part that sounds almost unbelievable. His own security staff found him lying on the floor, unconscious, in the early hours of the morning, but were too terrified of Stalin's own paranoid purges to enter his private quarters without explicit permission, since doing so uninvited had gotten previous staff arrested or killed. Historical accounts suggest it may have taken as long as 12 hours before doctors were finally summoned and allowed to examine him, a delay that likely made an already fatal stroke unsurvivable. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, 4 days after the stroke, at age 74, with members of the Politburo, men who had spent decades terrified of him, reportedly gathered around his deathbed, uncertain whether to celebrate or continue performing loyalty until the very last breath. The system of fear he had built was so effective that it very possibly killed him faster, by making his own staff too scared to save him. From Hitler's cyanide and bullet in a burning bunker, to Stalin bleeding out on his own floor while his terrified staff hesitated outside the door. The deaths keep escalating in irony as much as in violence. But nothing on this list matches what happens next. The final dictator on this video didn't die quickly, didn't die with dignity, and didn't die anywhere near a courtroom, a bunker, or a bed. He died in the street, over the course of hours, at the hands of the very people he'd ruled, and it was all captured on camera. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya for 42 years, longer than almost anyone else on this list, funding his regime with the country's oil wealth while running one of the most feared internal security services in North Africa. By 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings had spread to Libya, escalating into a full civil war between Gaddafi loyalists and NATO-backed rebel forces. On October 20, 2011, Gaddafi's convoy attempted to flee his hometown of Sirte, the last loyalist stronghold, after weeks of siege. A NATO airstrike hit the convoy on the road outside the city, and in the chaos, Gaddafi and a small group of bodyguards fled on foot and took shelter inside a large concrete drainage culvert running beneath the road, essentially hiding in a storm drain, the same man who had once addressed the United Nations from a golden tent. Rebel fighters found him within the hour. What followed was captured on multiple cell phone cameras by the fighters themselves and uploaded within hours, footage that spread globally almost immediately. Gaddafi was dragged out of the pipe, blooded, disoriented, and begging for his life on camera, reportedly saying "don't shoot" repeatedly as fighters swarmed him. He was beaten and abused by the crowd of fighters in the minutes that followed, sustaining serious injuries including a head wound, before being placed onto the hood of a pickup truck. By the time he arrived in the nearby city of Misrata roughly an hour later, he was dead. Official Libyan accounts at the time cited a gunshot wound, though the precise cause and sequence remains disputed and was never independently, fully investigated to international legal standards. His body was then placed on public display in a commercial meat freezer in Misrata for 4 days, so ordinary Libyans could file past and confirm with their own eyes that the man who had ruled them for 42 years was actually gone. A strange, informal echo of the embalmed mausoleum used for Kim Il-sung, except here it was a refrigerated storage room instead of a marble palace, and thousands of ordinary citizens instead of state-mandated visits. He was eventually buried in a secret desert location to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. Of every death on this list, the bunkers, the firing squads, the gallows, the highway ambushes, Gaddafi's is the only one where the final moments of a modern head of state's life were filmed in real time, from multiple angles, by the very crowd killing him, and uploaded to the internet before his body had even reached a hospital. It is the most complete, unfiltered document we have anywhere of a dictatorship's absolute final collapse. Power, to nothing, in under an hour, on camera. Look back across this list and the pattern is impossible to miss. The ones who spent the longest building a cult of personality, Hitler, Stalin, Gaddafi, tended to get the ugliest, most chaotic endings, while a handful of quieter men, like Franco, simply timed their exit before the reckoning arrived. Absolute power was never actually permanent for any of them. It just took different amounts of time, and a different amount of violence, for the bill to come due. If the image of Gaddafi hiding in a drainage pipe after 42 years in power stuck with you, you need to see our video on the fall of the Berlin Wall regimes, because half the men who fell with it aren't even household names anymore. Drop a comment, out of everyone on this list, whose death shocked you the most, and who do you think deserved a worse ending than they actually got? Hit subscribe if you want more of these deep dive explainers. Next up, we're covering every cult leader's downfall explained.